On a cold December night in 1865, in the quiet town of Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 Confederate veterans gathered in a law office that still smelled of gunpowder and defeat. The war had ended 8 months earlier, but for these men, John C. Lester, James R. Crowe, John D. Kennedy, Calvin Jones, Richard R. Reed, and Frank O. McCord, the true battle was only beginning. They were bored, restless, and bitter. The South they had fought for lay in ruins, and formerly enslaved people now walked as free citizens through streets these men considered their inheritance. What began as an evening of idle conversation about forming a social club would metasize into one of history's most enduring engines of organized terror. They chose the name with theatrical flair, drawing from the Greek word kyklos, meaning circle, and adding clan for alliteration and mystique. The Ku Klux Klan. Even the name whispered of secret rituals and hidden power. They designed costumes, white robes, and pointed hoods, originally meant as pranks to frighten superstitious freedmen with ghostly appearances. They gave themselves absurd titles: Grand Cyclops, Grand Magi, Grand Turk. It all seemed like harmless fraternity nonsense, the kind of ritualistic play acting that bored young men throughout history have indulged in. But beneath the carnival masks, something far darker was taking root. The timing of the Klan's birth was no accident. The Reconstruction era had begun, and with it came a social revolution that overturned every assumption the white South held sacred. The radical Republicans in Congress had passed laws granting citizenship to former slaves, establishing the Freedmen's Bureau, and sending federal troops to enforce new civil rights. Black men were voting, holding office, and owning land. To the defeated Confederacy, this wasn't justice, it was apocalypse. The world they had known, built on the bedrock of racial hierarchy, was dissolving. Into this existential terror, the Klan offered something intoxicating, a promise to restore the old order through any means necessary. By 1867, the Klan had spread like spilled ink across Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond. What had been 6 bored men in a small-town office had become a loosely organized network of white supremacist cells, each operating with frightening autonomy. The group held its first national convention in Nashville in 1867, where Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a wealthy slave trader before the war and the architect of the Fort Pillow massacre, was elected the first Grand Wizard. Forrest brought military discipline and strategic thinking to what had been chaotic vigilantism. Under his leadership, the Klan transformed from pranksters to paramilitaries. The ideology was brutally simple. White supremacy was not merely a preference but a divine mandate, a natural law as immutable as gravity. The Klan's rhetoric wrapped itself in the language of protection, protecting white women from the imagined threat of black male sexuality, protecting white civilization from mongrelization, protecting the Southern way of life from Northern aggression. But protection was always a euphemism. What they were really protecting was power, and they would defend it with rope, fire, and the gun. Recruitment into the Klan was deliberately shrouded in mystery and ceremony. New members were initiated in midnight rituals involving oaths sworn on Bibles, elaborate passwords, and secret handshakes. The pseudonyms weren't just whimsical, they created plausible deniability. A man could commit atrocities in his hood and robe, then return home to his respectable life as a shopkeeper or schoolteacher, his identity protected by the Brotherhood's code of silence. The uniform itself became a weapon of psychological warfare. When night riders appeared at a freedman's door, wearing ghostly white robes and carrying torches, they weren't just men, they were phantoms, devils, the physical manifestation of white rage given supernatural form. The Reconstruction-era Klan operated with shocking brazenness. They whipped, shot, and lynched black citizens and white Republicans who supported racial equality. They burned schools and churches. They stuffed ballot boxes and intimidated voters. Their violence had a clear political purpose: to nullify the 14th and 15th Amendments through terror where they had failed to prevent them through law. And it worked. By 1871, the federal government was forced to respond with the Ku Klux Klan Act, which allowed President Grant to suspend habeas corpus and deploy federal troops against the organization. Forrest officially disbanded the Klan in 1869, but the damage was done. The seeds of organized racial terror had been planted deep in Southern soil. The Klan would lie dormant for decades, but it never truly died. In 1915, William Joseph Simmons, a Methodist preacher and Spanish-American war veteran, resurrected it atop Stone Mountain, Georgia. This second Klan was different, more organized, more explicitly Christian, and more commercially minded. Simmons marketed membership like a product, recruiting not just in the South but across America. This new Klan expanded its hate to include Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and anyone deemed un-American. At its peak in the 1,920 seconds, it claimed millions of members and wielded genuine political power, electing governors, senators, and controlling entire state legislatures. The third major resurgence came in response to the civil rights movement of the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. As Black Americans organized sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration drives, the Klan answered with bombings and murders. This iteration was smaller but perhaps most vicious, responsible for some of America's most notorious acts of racial terrorism. The Birmingham church bombing that killed 4 little girls, the murders of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Mississippi, countless other acts of violence that have faded from collective memory but remain seared into the communities they devastated. What enabled the Klan's persistence across a century wasn't just hatred, it was complicity. Sheriffs who were themselves members, judges who refused to convict, newspapers that blamed the victims, churches that preached white supremacy from the pulpit, entire communities that chose silence over justice because disrupting the racial order seemed more dangerous than tolerating murder. The Klan could only exist because America allowed it to exist, because millions of people who never wore the hood benefited from the terror it created and the social boundaries it enforced. The night Mary Turner died, she was 8 months pregnant. It was May 1918 inches, Lowndes County, Georgia, and her husband Hayes had been lynched the day before as part of a manhunt following the killing of a white plantation owner. Mary's crime was speaking out. She had dared to publicly protest her husband's murder and threatened to press charges against the mob. For this act of defiance, a crowd of several hundred white men and women gathered near the Little River. They bound Mary by her ankles, hung her upside down from a tree, doused her clothes in gasoline, and set her on fire. While she burned, a man named Sidney Johnson stepped forward and used a knife ordinarily reserved for splitting hogs to cut open her abdomen. Her unborn child fell to the ground, gave 2 cries, and was stomped to death. Then the mob riddled Mary's body with hundreds of bullets. When asked why he participated, one member of the mob later said simply, "We wanted to show these damn niggers what would happen to them if they tried to protect one of their own." This is the story the Ku Klux Klan doesn't want told, not the mythology of white-robed defenders, not the theatrical cross-burnings, but the actual mechanics of their terror. Because what the Klan perfected across generations wasn't merely violence. It was the systematic transformation of cruelty into a social technology, a method of control that didn't just punish individual transgressions, but taught entire communities the price of resistance. They didn't just kill people, they engineered fear itself into the fabric of American life. The Klan's arsenal of terror was vast and varied, calibrated to maximize both physical suffering and psychological devastation. Lynching was their signature, but the word itself sanitizes what actually occurred. These weren't quick deaths. They were public spectacles of torture, often advertised in advance. In 1893, Henry Smith was accused of killing a white child in Paris, Texas. A special train was chartered to bring spectators from nearby towns. An estimated 10,000 people gathered to watch as Smith was placed on a scaffold in the town square. For nearly an hour, red-hot iron brands were applied to his body, pressed against his tongue, his eyes, his private areas, while the crowd cheered. His screams, witnesses reported, could be heard for miles. Only after this prolonged torture was he burned alive. Photographers sold pictures of his charred corpse as postcards. Some were mailed through the U.S. Postal Service with messages like, "This is the barbecue we had last night." Lynchings followed a terrible pattern across the South and beyond. Between 1882 and 1968, at least 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States, with 3,446 victims being Black Americans, according to Tuskegee Institute records. But these numbers capture only documented cases. Countless murders went unrecorded. Bodies disappeared into rivers or buried in unmarked graves. The Equal Justice Initiative's more recent research has identified thousands more victims. Each lynching was both an execution and a warning. The bodies were left hanging for days, sometimes for weeks, to ensure the message was received. In some towns, lynchings became community events. Schools closed so children could attend. Vendors sold food and drinks. People posed for photographs beneath dangling corpses, smiling as though at a carnival. But lynching was only the most visible method. The Klan employed a repertoire of tortures designed to terrorize while often leaving victims alive to spread fear. Whippings were commonplace, not mere beatings but systematic flayings that left backs ribboned with scars. In York County, South Carolina, during Reconstruction, Klansmen used leather straps studded with metal to whip hundreds of black citizens. Elias Hill, a black minister and teacher who was disabled and weighed less than 100 pounds, was dragged from his home in 1871 by disguised men who beat him with hickory sticks, all while demanding he stop teaching and preaching. His testimony before Congress described men who pulled my shirt up over my head. They hit me at the back of my head, and as they did that, it made me senseless. Then they began to scrape my hip bone with something like a currycomb, as it seemed to me. Castration was another favored method, particularly in cases where black men were accused, almost always falsely, of inappropriate contact with white women. The fear of black male sexuality was obsessive in Klan ideology, a projection of white guilt and anxiety that manifested in grotesque violence. In countless cases, victims were castrated before being lynched, their private parts sometimes displayed as trophies or souvenirs taken by mob members. When Jesse Washington, a 17-year-old mentally disabled farmhand, was lynched in Waco, Texas in 1916, the mob castrated him with a knife before burning him alive in front of the county courthouse. 15,000 people watched. The mayor and police chief were present and did nothing. Drowning offered another form of execution that left bodies harder to find. The Ku Klux Klan would weight victims with chains or rocks and throw them into rivers, lakes, or swamps. In 1946, two young black couples, Roger and Dorothy Malcolm, George and May Murray Dorsey, were pulled from a car at Moore's Ford Bridge in Georgia by a mob of at least 20 men. They were tied to trees and shot more than 60 times. George Dorsey was a World War II veteran who had just returned from serving his country in the Pacific. The FBI investigated but claimed they couldn't identify any of the killers, despite the fact that the murders occurred in daylight and dozens of people knew who was involved. Local residents maintained a code of silence for decades. To this day, no one has been prosecuted. The message was clear. Not even military service would protect black Americans from white violence. Fire was perhaps the Klan's most symbolically potent weapon, manifesting in both the iconic burning cross and in the immolation of human beings. The burning cross itself derived from the Scottish Klan's tradition of the Crann Tara, or fiery cross, a signal to gather for war. William Simmons, the Klan's second-era founder, borrowed this from his reading of Sir Walter Scott's romantic novels and transformed it into a ritual of intimidation. A burning cross on a lawn was a death threat, a warning, a declaration of ownership. It said, "We know where you live, we know who you are, and we can come for you whenever we choose." The first burning cross of the modern Klan blazed on Stone Mountain in 1915, but within years they appeared everywhere, on courthouse lawns, in black neighborhoods, in front of integrated schools and businesses. The crosses served multiple purposes. They terrified targeted individuals, they rallied Klan members, and they marked territory as belonging to white supremacy. But crosses weren't the only things the Klan burned. They burned people alive with horrifying regularity. In 1918, when Brooks County, Georgia, erupted in racial violence after a black man killed a white farmer in self-defense, at least 13 black people were killed in the resulting manhunt. Several were tied to trees and burned. Sidney Johnson, the same man who murdered Mary Turner's unborn child, bragged about participating in multiple burnings that week. The terror extended beyond individuals to entire communities. The Klan burned homes, churches, and schools with such frequency that insurance companies in some areas refused to cover black-owned properties. When the all-black town of Rosewood, Florida was destroyed in 1923, white mobs burned virtually every structure to the ground over the course of a week, killing at least 6 people and driving all residents out permanently. The town ceased to exist. Mock executions represented a particularly sadistic form of psychological torture. Klansmen would stage elaborate preparations for lynching, placing nooses around victims' necks, forcing them to stand on chairs or in truck beds, making them believe they were about to die, then release them at the last moment as a warning. The trauma of these near-death experiences was itself a form of control, ensuring that victims lived in perpetual terror, never knowing when the Klan might return to finish what they'd started. In other cases, mock trials were held where victims were forced to confess to fabricated crimes before punishment was administered. These kangaroo courts provided a veneer of legitimacy to acts of pure terrorism. The Klan expanded their targets beyond black Americans to include anyone who threatened their vision of a white Protestant America. Jewish businessmen in the South received threats and were sometimes beaten or their stores vandalized. Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager in Atlanta, was lynched in 1915 by a mob that included prominent citizens after the governor commuted his controversial death sentence. The lynching helped inspire the Klan's revival that same year. Catholic immigrants, particularly Italians and Irish, faced Klan intimidation in northern cities during the 1922. Labor organizers were beaten and killed. In Herrin, Illinois, in 1924, Glenn Young, a Klan leader and former Prohibition agent, led raids against Catholic immigrants he accused of bootlegging, beating them in their homes. White people who supported civil rights became targets during the 1960s. Viola Liuzzo, a Detroit mother of 5, was murdered by Klansmen on Highway 80 Inches, Alabama, after participating in the Selma to Montgomery marches. The men who killed her, Collie Leroy Wilkins, William Eaton, Eugene Thomas, and Gary Thomas Rowe, pulled up beside her car and fired a shotgun through her window. When she was found dead, one Klansman reportedly said, "We got her good." What made the Klan's violence particularly devastating was the infrastructure of complicity that protected it. Local law enforcement didn't just look the other way, they often participated. Sheriff Lawrence Rainey and Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price in Neshoba County, Mississippi, were directly involved in the 1964 murders of civil rights workers Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. They arrested the 3 men on a trumped-up speeding charge, held them in jail until nightfall, then released them directly into the hands of waiting Klansmen. Price followed the victim's car and signaled the ambush site by flashing his lights. When the bodies were discovered weeks later buried in an earthen dam, FBI agents found that at least 21 men had participated, including a Baptist minister and members of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. In the eventual federal trial, 7 men were convicted, but only of civil rights violations, not murder. The longest sentence was 10 years, and most served less than 6. Coroners routinely ruled obvious murders as suicides or accidents. When Emmett Till's mutilated body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River in 1955, beaten beyond recognition, shot in the head, and tied to a 75-pound cotton gin fan with barbed wire, the local sheriff tried to quickly bury him, claiming the body was too decomposed to identify. Only Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, insisting on an open casket funeral in Chicago, revealed to the world what white supremacy actually looked like. Judges dismissed cases, juries acquitted obvious perpetrators, and entire communities maintained walls of silence. In the 1963 Birmingham church bombing that killed 4 little girls, it took until 1977 to convict the first perpetrator, Robert Chambliss, 14 years after children were blown apart. The other participants, Thomas Blanton Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry, weren't convicted until 2001 and 2002, nearly 4 decades after their crime. Yet within this architecture of terror, resistance persisted. Ida B. Wells, a black journalist whose friend was lynched in Memphis in 1892, launched an anti-lynching crusade that documented hundreds of cases and challenged the lies used to justify them. She proved that the majority of lynching victims weren't accused of any serious offense, as white supremacists claimed, but were killed for economic competition, political organizing, or simply existing while black. Her investigative journalism forced America to confront truths it preferred to ignore. The NAACP, founded in 1909, made anti-lynching legislation a primary goal, though Congress repeatedly refused to pass such laws despite decades of advocacy. Southern senators filibustered every attempt. Individual acts of courage shone through the darkness. When Fannie Lou Hamer registered to vote in 1962, she was beaten so severely by police in a Mississippi jail that she suffered permanent kidney damage and lost vision in one eye. She continued organizing anyway, famously challenging the all-white Mississippi delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. When Medgar Evers was assassinated in his driveway in 1963, his wife Merle continued his work, eventually serving as chair of the NAACP and successfully prosecuting his killer 30 years later. When Vernon Dahmer's home was firebombed by Klansmen in 1966, he died from his burns but not before holding off attackers long enough for his wife and children to escape. His last words were reportedly, "I'm not going to die in vain." The invitation arrived by word of mouth, passing from neighbor to neighbor like news of a county fair. On the 7th of August 1930, in Marion, Indiana, thousands of white residents made their way to the town square, many bringing their children, picnic baskets, and cameras. They came to witness what had been promised as entertainment, the lynching of 3 young black men accused of murder and a grave misconduct. Thomas Shipp, Abram Smith, and James Cameron, the youngest only 16 years old, had been arrested the day before. By nightfall, a crowd estimated at 10,000 to 15,000 had gathered outside the Grant County Jail, their voices rising in a chant that sounded almost like a sporting event. "We want the niggers! We want the niggers!" When the mob finally broke through the jail doors using sledgehammers and crowbars, they dragged Shipp and Smith to a maple tree on the courthouse lawn. The crowd fell silent as nooses were placed around the young men's necks, a theatrical pause before the main event. Then came the cheers as the ropes tightened. Photographers moved through the crowd, setting up equipment to capture the moment. Studio portraits would be taken later, with spectators posing beside the dangling bodies, pointing and smiling as though they'd caught a prize fish. One photograph shows a woman in the crowd pointing upward toward the corpses, while others grin at the camera. Lawrence Beitler, a local photographer, took the iconic image that night and made his studio's monthly rent, selling thousands of copies at 50 cents each. The spectacle wasn't incidental to the violence. It was the entire point. This was the Klan's grand theater, where death was not merely an outcome but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to assert dominance, enforce racial hierarchy, and transform murder into a communal ritual that bound white spectators together in collective guilt and shared power. The Ku Klux Klan understood something fundamental about human psychology that modern terrorists would later exploit, that public violence witnessed by communities creates deeper trauma than private killings, that forcing people to watch, whether willingly or under coercion, makes them complicit, and that transforming cruelty into spectacle magnifies its psychological impact exponentially. Every lynching, every burning, every midnight raid was staged with the precision of a director crafting a scene, complete with costumes, props, lighting, and an audience whose presence was as essential as the violence itself. The pageantry began long before the actual killing. Clan rituals of capture were themselves performances designed to maximize terror and demonstrate absolute power over victims' lives. Night riders would arrive on horseback, often dozens or hundreds strong, dressed in their white robes and hoods that transformed individual men into an anonymous collective force. The costumes served multiple purposes. They provided legal protection through anonymity, they created a supernatural aura of ghostly vengeance, and they unified disparate individuals into a single threatening entity. When the clan came for a victim, they didn't simply shoot or hang them quickly. They created elaborate productions. In Valdosta, Georgia, in 1918, Mary Turner wasn't just murdered, her killing was announced in advance, allowing time for crowds to gather from surrounding counties. The mob performed her execution at a specific location, Folsom's Bridge near the Little River, chosen for its accessibility and symbolic resonance. The choice to hang her upside down, to mutilate her unborn child in front of spectators, to shoot her body hundreds of times, these weren't spontaneous acts of rage but calculated elements of a grotesque performance designed to send an unmistakable message about the consequences of black resistance. Mock trials represented perhaps the Klan's most perverse theatrical innovation, wrapping murder in the trappings of legal procedure to create a veneer of legitimacy. These kangaroo courts followed a predictable script. The victim would be dragged before a gathering of hooded figures. Accusations would be read aloud, evidence would be presented, and a verdict would be predetermined. The victim might be allowed to speak in their defense, though their words meant nothing. The trial was theater, not justice. In some cases, victims were forced to participate in their own condemnation, made to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, to beg for mercy that would not come, to perform the role of the guilty party so that spectators could witness what they believed was justice being served. During Reconstruction, in York County, South Carolina, Klansmen held midnight courts where black men accused of voting Republican or acting uppity would be tried by hooded judges, sentenced to whipping or death, and punished immediately. The proceedings mimicked legal forms. There were prosecutors and defenders, witnesses, and formal pronouncements of guilt, but the outcome was never in doubt. The ritual served to legitimate violence in the minds of participants and to terrorize victims through the mockery of the very legal systems that were supposed to protect them. The transformation of victims into performers of their own suffering added layers of psychological torture to physical violence. Before being killed, victims were sometimes forced to dance, sing, or otherwise entertain their murderers and the gathered crowd. In some documented lynchings, victims were made to crawl on their knees, to kiss the feet of their tormentors, to thank their killers for mercy that consisted of choosing one method of death over another. During the 1916 Waco lynching of Jesse Washington, the teenager was mutilated piece by piece over 2 hours while the crowd watched, with each escalation of violence treated as a new act in an ongoing performance. Spectators shouted suggestions for further torments. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders to see better. The extended duration wasn't necessary for killing. Washington could have been shot in seconds, but the spectacle required time, required the drawn-out display of suffering, required the crowd's sustained attention and participation. The performance taught not just Washington but every black person who heard about it that white supremacy held absolute power over black bodies, that death could come slowly and publicly, and that no one would intervene. The role of the spectator was as carefully choreographed as the violence itself. These weren't chaotic mob actions, but organized community events with distinct phases and audience participation cues. The gathering phase saw crowds assembling, often with advance notice that allowed time for people to travel from neighboring towns. Special trains were chartered for major lynchings. Newspapers sometimes printed announcements. In Marietta, Georgia, when Leo Frank was lynched in 1915, the event attracted thousands of spectators who began arriving at dawn to secure good viewing positions. Vendors sold refreshments. As the violence began, the crowd's role shifted from observer to chorus, their cheers and shouts providing audio accompaniment to the visual horror. In the photographs from Marion, Indiana, The spectators are as important as the victims. Their faces reveal excitement, satisfaction, curiosity, and in some cases, a disturbing joy. They point at the bodies, smile for cameras, position their children for better views. Their presence wasn't passive. They were co-performers in the ritual, their witness validating the violence and distributing guilt so broadly that individual accountability became impossible. The crowd served additional functions beyond mere observation. Their numbers intimidated potential rescuers and overwhelmed any law enforcement officers who might have considered intervention. Their collective presence transformed individual acts of murder into communal statements, making lynching not a crime but an expression of community values. When thousands of people participate in or witness a killing without consequence, it normalizes violence and teaches that terror is socially acceptable, even celebrated. Children brought to lynchings learned that black lives held no value, that white solidarity required participation in or silent acceptance of atrocity, and that violence could be entertainment. The psychological impact rippled through generations. Claude Neal, lynched in Marianna, Florida, in 1934, was tortured for hours before thousands of spectators who had been invited via radio announcements and printed circulars. The crowd included children who watched as Neal was mutilated, castrated, and burned. What lessons did those children carry into adulthood? How did witnessing that horror shape their understanding of race, justice, and humanity? The symbolic props of violence were chosen with deliberate theatrical impact. The burning cross, the Klan's most iconic symbol, was never merely functional. It was pure theater, a flaming stage prop that illuminated the night and marked territory as conquered by white supremacy. The cross itself carried religious symbolism that blasphemously connected racial terror to Christianity, suggesting divine sanction for violence. When crosses burned on lawns or hillsides, they could be seen for miles, their light visible to entire communities. The spectacle of the burning cross declared, "We are here, we are many, we are watching, and we can act with impunity." The cross burnings often preceded violence, creating anticipation and dread. Families who saw a cross burning nearby knew they might be next. The waiting itself was torture. In 1951, Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriet were murdered when Klansmen bombed their home in Mims, Florida, on Christmas night. Before the bombing, crosses had burned regularly in their area, creating an atmosphere of escalating threat. The crosses were warnings, preludes to the main performance. Ropes were another prop heavy with symbolism. The noose represented frontier justice, vigilante power, and the circumvention of legal systems. When bodies hung from trees, bridges, or courthouse squares, often for days, the rope became a stage element in an ongoing performance. The location of hangings was never random. Courthouses represented legal authority that the Klan was superseding. Trees in town squares placed violence at the geographic and social center of communities. Bridges marked boundaries and crossings, suggesting that racial lines must not be crossed. The Little River Bridge, where Mary Turner died, the Moores Ford Bridge, where the two couples were murdered in 1946, the bridge in Okama, Oklahoma, where Laura and L.D. Nelson were hanged in 1911. These became stages for performances meant to be remembered, talked about, and incorporated into the collective memory of what happens to those who resist white supremacy. Fire served as both execution method and visual spectacle, its dramatic effect unmatched by other forms of violence. When victims were burned alive, sometimes on pyres built specifically for the purpose, sometimes doused in gasoline or kerosene, the flames created a horrifying focal point that drew all eyes. The light from burning bodies could be seen for miles, announcing the violence to those who weren't present. The screams carried through the night, adding audio horror to the visual spectacle. The smell of burning flesh haunted communities for days, a lingering reminder of what had occurred. In Paris, Texas, in 1893, Henry Smith's burning was staged on a scaffold built 10 feet high so that the crowd of 10,000 could all see clearly. The scaffold was a literal stage, elevating the violence to ensure maximum visibility. The torture with hot irons before the burning provided a first act to the performance, building tension and horror before the climactic immolation. The crowd's cheers crescendoed with each escalation, their voices providing the soundtrack to Smith's agony. The performance continued even after death. The bodies themselves became props in an extended show. They were photographed from multiple angles, sometimes repositioned for better pictures. Spectators posed with corpses, creating souvenir images that were printed as postcards and sold commercially. These lynching postcards were mailed through the United States Postal Service, some with handwritten notes describing the event as entertainment, until the practice was banned in 1908, though underground distribution continued for decades. The images served as advertisements for white supremacy, visual evidence of total dominance that could be shared, collected, and displayed. Some photographs were turned into stereoscopic cards for 3D viewing, transforming atrocity into a parlor entertainment. Body parts were taken as souvenirs: fingers, toes, ears, private parts, pieces of rope, fragments of the tree or clothing. These grotesque mementos were kept in jars, carried as talismans, or publicly displayed in store windows. After the lynching of Jesse Washington, his charred remains were dragged through Waco's streets behind a horse. Then his body was hung from a pole in front of a blacksmith shop, where it remained on display. The exhibition of corpses extended the performance for days or weeks, ensuring that the terror remained fresh and visible. The psychological warfare embedded in these spectacles was devastatingly effective. Every public lynching terrorized thousands who weren't present but heard about it. Every photograph that circulated reinforced the message of white supremacy's absolute power. Every unpunished murder demonstrated that legal systems would not protect Black Americans. The performances created what Isabel Wilkerson calls the theater of the rope, a genre of terror so pervasive that it drove 6 million Black Americans to flee the South during the Great Migration between 1916 and 1970. They weren't just fleeing violence, but fleeing the constant performance of violence. The daily reminder that they lived in a society where their deaths could become entertainment, where their suffering could be spectacle, where their humanity was denied not just legally and economically but theatrically in public rituals designed to strip them of dignity even in death. The Klan's theatrical approach to violence reveals something disturbing about human nature and social control, that public ritual can transform moral atrocity into shared experience that bonds communities through collective transgression. When thousands of people participate in or witness murder without consequence, it creates what psychologists call diffusion of responsibility. No individual feels accountable because everyone was involved. The theatrical elements, the costumes, the props, the staging, the audience, created psychological distance that allowed participants to view violence not as murder, but as performance, not as crime, but as communal expression. The rituals provided structure that made chaos feel ordered, made sadistic cruelty feel like justice, made terrorism feel like tradition. And so, from the ashes of the Civil War to the marches of the Civil Rights era, the shadow of the Ku Klux Klan has lingered, a grim reminder of how fear can disguise itself as patriotism. Formed in 1,865 inches, Pulaski, Tennessee, by ex-Confederate soldiers like Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Klan once tried to rewrite history in white robes and burning crosses. But as Martin Luther King Jr. warned, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. If there's one lesson the Klan leaves behind, it's that intolerance only fades when people refuse to let hate speak louder than humanity. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next story.